So the Other Person Problem training series, we've been doing a 4-part series. This is this is part 3. So for part 3 of this Other Person Problem training, we are focusing on the foundations of reality. So just a quick overview. One of the ideas of this training is that we need a way to coordinate, and we need a way to each of us bring our facet. I use the disco ball analogy, that we have a facet of our desire and what we're wanting to bring into the world. And at the same time, we need a way to align. We need a way to be able to have the facets of the disco ball align with each other. And over the last 30 years, I've developed this framework, the 4 forces. And what I found was I kept asking the question, like, if there's so many different versions of a better world, how can we possibly find a common denominator? Are there any common desires that we all have that we can all say yes to? And what I found was there was just these 4 that are really at the heart of everything. When you look at why do you want what you want, I kept coming into these same 4 forces. So their connection, the idea that we want to love and be loved, that we want to belong. The idea, as much as we want to belong, we also want to be seen and heard and recognized for our uniqueness, for our individuality. And we also want to contribute. We want to feel like we're part of something greater. We want to have meaning and significance. There's like the meaning crisis right now because it's one of the foundational things that we need as humans. And then also, as much as we want order and meaning, we also want novelty. We want to thrive. We want tomorrow to be better than today. We want this idea of progress and a feeling of creativity and mastery over our world, which I put in this category of growth. And what I found as I worked with them is that these desires are not just desires. We also create strategies around them, because if we don't really understand what they are and how to get it, how do I get somebody to love me, or how do I love somebody? Then we end up creating these strategies to try to get them and try to get some part of it. And that is the sort of foundation of the other person problem. If we don't really understand how to get these desires, then that causes all sorts of tangles. And I found that worldviews and cultural trends are all based on people coming together that have similar worldviews and similar strategies. And as I worked with them over the last 30 years, I found that there were skills involved for each of these, and that ultimately these were states of consciousness, that when we're wanting and desiring something, we're really desiring a feeling. We're desiring a state of consciousness. And as I even worked more with those, I found that each of these forces are actually really foundational to how we experience reality itself. And it's my belief and my personal experience that these are core fundamental aspects of reality. So where I want to start is there's a common map of consciousness that people use, and it's the David Hawkins power versus force kind of model, power versus force model. And this is a pretty common way that we think about states of consciousness and think about higher vibration and spirituality. We sort of think like, oh, there's these negative ones and then there's these positive ones. And for the most part, I find that people really just have one experience of that state of enlightenment. The idea, it's often this idea of high vibe, sort of Eckhart Tolle, for example, his experience of sitting in bliss on the park bench for 2 years. There's sort of this hierarchy. And what I want to propose is that instead of a hierarchy, that we actually expand this map of consciousness, that each of these forces give us a range. And we have fear and kind of lower versions of them, and we also have higher ecstatic versions of them, but they're not even necessarily, the way I experience them isn't good or bad or right or wrong or better than. It's like, it's more about how to actually have flexibility of consciousness and be able to navigate and understand where you are and why, and be able to shift your state at will. So I also think of these spectrum of states for the call today. I'm focusing I'm going to share a little bit about the fears, and there's all sorts of stuff that can also happen when you are in the different states. There's different skill sets that you need, and especially if you're wanting to facilitate, if you're a leader, understanding what can happen in what I call edgy spaces, whether that's a non-ordinary space or a transformational space. But I want to focus today just on sort of this idea of the spectrum and the range. So if we think of sort of our everyday states, these are like we go in and out of moods and we go in and out of states all the time. We don't even really think about them as states. And then there's those moments that are like peak, and we talk a lot about those in commonly and openly in society, flow states. And there's common stuff of this, like, oh, I had a good mood, or oh man, my heart broke open, right? There's these moments where we're like having these peak experiences. And then I want to make a distinction between the peak and then sort of the idea of non-ordinary states, that these aren't common states that we experience or that we talk about. Let me say it that way, because I think we do commonly experience them, but we don't often talk about them. They're a little bit more tricky. This is where all our disclaimers come in. I know it sounds weird, but so, and then finally, I also want to make another distinction around ecstatic states. And ecstatic states are those ones that we point to and say, like that was beyond even sort of a non-ordinary state. It had a volume to it, an intensity to it. And I'm gonna name for each of the forces what that ecstatic state is. And for a lot of us, we've experienced some taste of all of these. I found even the ecstatic, there's often some sense. And for those people doing psychedelics or sacred medicines, the ecstatic states are becoming more and more common in our everyday experience and language. So I also want to name that skills and states and traits are all informed by each other in this model, and the way that I think about these foundations and these states of consciousness. So let's dive into the first one, connection. So I want to we often think about connection as something that's created, that we have to do something to experience connection. But I want to actually flip that and say connection is about experiencing. So as we experience, it's the skill of perception and experiencing. So as we experience more, as we focus on our senses more, our sense of self tends to drop away. And there's this idea of what are you bringing your attention to? That what we bring our attention to is what we experience. So over here, from sameness, I'm going to kind of go through these more. So I'll just quickly, but from like this idea of sameness to sort of no sense of other at all to no self, there's this sort of spectrum. And if we start to look at these as sort of in that frame of day to day versus peak versus non-ordinary or expanded, it's taking that list and kind of putting them into sort of what's more common and how we think about them. The day to day would be that sort of sameness, belonging, sort of gratitude. There's these wonderful connection feelings. And empathy, I kind of put in the peak because it's not every day. You kind of have to sometimes have an effort to feel empathy. It doesn't always just kind of naturally happen. For some of us, it does. For others, it doesn't. But then the idea of mindfulness, too, when we're teaching mindfulness skills, mindfulness is all about bringing your attention to the now. And the idea of openness, of not being defended, that feeling can be very peak in our lives. And then we move into the more non-ordinary, the idea of oneness, one with life. Often we experience oneness in nature. And I want to make a distinction here between oneness and this idea of no self, pure awareness, pure consciousness, non-dual state. And non-dual to me is not the ultimate, it's one of the states that we can experience. So that when oneness, there's still a sense of something or identity in it. I'm part of the oneness. But when we drop into pure awareness, there's no self at all. Self completely drops away. And some of the access points here, nature, I mentioned, meditation, the skills of mindfulness, we space practices, group experiences can often bring us into that we oneness space. But I want to talk about like the molecule of 5-MeO-DMT has gained a lot of popularity, and that's one of those medicines that just your identity, your sense of self, any separateness completely drops away. And MDMA is another one where your sense of separateness kind of melts a bit, and you're able to feel more openness. So with this, like the 5-MeO, for example, I found that clients, I work often with people, Atlee's talked about this in my supporting him in his DMT trial that he did. But it's often with connection or with use of like 5-MeO, it can be terrifying to drop sense of self. We think of it as bliss, but it can feel like you're drowning. It can feel like you're being annihilated, like you're losing yourself. The idea of being assimilated, like the Borg in Star Trek. So there's reasons why we tend to focus on sort of certain states that we like or don't like. So I'm just kind of, there's a lot more here and a lot that can happen as you're navigating these states, but just to give a little taste of it. And here's where I want to really shift and think about the connection as a foundation. And I experience when you focus on experiencing, well, I see connection as consciousness. And my experience of it is that it's not something that's created or emergent from matter, but it's actually foundational. And there is a lot of science and a lot of growing, there's a lot of versions of it, like panpsychism and idealism. There's a lot of different versions. But when we start to really feel it as the sort of one of the real foundational pieces of life, it definitely opens us up and creates a different opportunity for how we engage. I will make the slides available as a separate download because there's a lot of quotes in these slides. But just to think of it as consciousness, how we're defining consciousness is about experiencing. That consciousness is experience itself. What is it like to be something, to experience something? So this is where I make the link that connection is consciousness ultimately. And then the idea of prompting life. I'm going to be doing a series after this one called Prompting Life, where we look at each of these forces as a way that we're engaging with life and we're actually putting out information just like we would prompt AI. And if you think of life as the ultimate intelligence, we're prompting life through a lot of different ways in our engagement with it. And when we consciously understand those levers and how we're prompting life, we now can have a much different kind of relationship with life and with each other also. So one of the ways that we prompt through connection is where are we bringing our awareness? Where are we bringing our attention? I shared this example in the last training. If you're when we fall in love with somebody, all we notice that we bring our attention to all of the things we love about them. And then suddenly, somebody will say to me, I fell out of love with my partner. And I'm like, well, what did you start paying attention to? Because usually when we've fallen out of love, we start paying attention to all the things we don't like about somebody. So where we bring our attention is actually what we experience. So when we start to understand that, that opens up a whole bunch of more options. And sort of thoughts that we focus on, same sort of thing. We're bringing our attention to it. And also using our emotions as a way of, as a kind of GPS and a way to navigate. Emotions are that sense feeling, the internal feeling, right, of being able to know and sense your own inner experience. So that's connection. Expression. Let's move on to expression. So where connection is consciousness and this feeling in the experiencing of life, I see expression as shifting from this idea of authenticity or sharing myself to the idea of a faceted point of view. So where are you experiencing from? And so when you have this shift with expression, you're then able to experience. So you've got what are you looking at, but then where are you experiencing from? There's a whole variety and a fractal. You can experience life from your higher self or from your God self or from your little boy or girl, or you can experience a part of yourself like internal family systems. And there's also this experience of when you have this point of focus, when you have this sort of point of view, then we can start to look at what are the states that come from that when you are able to actually feel yourself. So from day to day, there can be a sense of separateness. And, there's a lot of loneliness epidemic and a lot of downsides to when we get caught in separateness and isolation. And those are states of consciousness also, right? So, and there is also this idea of separateness as individuality, as distinctness, as identity. Like it's useful to think I'm a mother and take on that identity, or I'm a facilitator, I'm putting on my facilitator hat. So we do this all day, day to day, in how we're experiencing ourselves and where we're looking from. We just don't necessarily recognize it as that. But every time we say, well, let me put on my problem solver hat, or let me put on my friend, or my facilitator, that is a shift of point of view. And I also, at those peak states, there's that sense of sovereignty, of authenticity, of being uninhibited, of feeling powerful. A lot of the expression states kind of are enhanced by expression and by growth, which I'll show later, which is life force. So as we have more life force in us, we feel ourselves more. And it's a very pleasurable experience to feel our uniqueness and our embodied selves. So, when you're disconnected and you're not in that, then it can be very, like, you can't even feel pleasure when you're disconnected from your body and from yourself and from your sense of individuality. And then the higher states I mentioned, like, you can look from the higher self or from a soul self. You can change your point of view and experience yourself as something else, even. So, in some of these non-ordinary experiences, like psychedelics and meditations, Ali, I think, wrote in his book about the experience on one of, I think, in DMT, of having suddenly finding himself being an old woman in a tribe. And like, we can have these transcending the self where our perspective and point of view actually changes and we are the other perspective. And there's also sort of multi-point consciousness. I could even probably put that in the ecstatic, but multi-point consciousness. I talk about my experience of it in my book, of suddenly being like Trishness and this feeling my individuality, and also at the same time feeling myself as every other point. And the analogy that I would use is this idea of like a flock of birds, where I was experiencing myself as as a separate bird, as each bird, and also the consciousness of the flock itself, all at the same time. So that was a very ecstatic experience. And I would say the peak experience, which is very different than the peak experience, ecstatic experience of expression, that's very different than the ecstatic experience of connection, which is no self. The ecstatic experience of expression is I am God. It's God's self. I am the universe. I am omniscient. I find people that have manic episodes, this is an ecstatic state. It's why often they don't want to take their meds. It's really quite amazing. But you can work with it. I have a manic somebody who has manic episodes that as they're learning these skills, they're able to manage going in and out of it with more control, for example. So some common access points, embodiment practices, even journaling, like being able to get your like the Artist's Way practice of just getting your thoughts down can help you feel a more sense of self. I was sharing here manic episodes. I don't recommend using that as an access point, but it is. Personal development work, voice work. I did voice lessons for a year where I was really focused on just feeling myself through my voice. Martial arts often does a lot of life force work as well, which is growth. But a lot of it is about that embodiment and that sense of self and sense of power. And I would say that in this category, LSD is more of a medicine that often they talk about ego, the different kinds of ego impact that LSD has, where you can be God self or no self. But it tends to, my experience with working with people that do these medicines is LSD tends to focus more on that sort of God self experience. So, and here's where, as a foundation of life, I want to really focus on expression as agency, as the observer, as the prompter, as the chooser. It is the way that the universe is experiencing itself through multiple points of view. So if you think of expression as like you right now sitting, we're all on the same call, but everybody has their own experience of what's happening, even though we're having a joint consensus experience. So when we understand that each of us have this unique point of consciousness and that we can also change it, and there's fractals and there's all sorts of cool stuff you can do when you learn the skills of this, without expression, without this agency, without this point of view, consciousness itself has no way of experiencing itself. So expression is that point that allows us to experience, for consciousness to experience itself. There's a bunch of quotes here too, right? That Consciousness is experience itself. Reality is in consciousness, and each of us is a disassociated segment of the universal mind. Bernardo Kastrup is a philosopher and a consciousness studies professor, and he talks about in idealism is a form of for a consciousness sort of theory. In idealism, the idea he's using the metaphor of sort of multiple personality disorder, that consciousness has multiple personalities, and each of us are this fragment of universal mind. But that's also the only way that we can actually engage with each other, is to have these points of view. Otherwise, you're just in beingness with no self at all. And some of the expression fears is aloneness, isolation, ostracization, and the idea of being in solitary confinement as punishment and purpose, punishment in prison, or the idea of isolation chambers and lack of sensory input can actually drive you insane. So the fear of too much expression of that lever is that feeling of complete isolation and aloneness. So how do we prompt life through expression? We prompt life through desires. What is our unique facet that we're bringing into the world? What choices are we make? We are conscious agents. I love Donald Hoffman's work, and he talks about conscious agents are the prompters. They're the people. They're the entities, because it's not just people. There's a lot of philosophies, a lot of theories right now about everything having a point of view, and in a lot of ways, even cells of our bodies are prompting life and have a sense of agency. So what we follow and what choices we make, this is the idea of how we're prompting through expression. Now, looking at purpose, from purpose, we often think of purpose as my role or my function. And the skill of it is about sense making, about meaning making, and about relationship. So the reason why we have a role or a function, it's always about our relationship. How are we contributing? So that's where role and function come in. But I want to broaden that and really look at it as the skills of relationship, including things like structure, order. So day to day, it's habits, it's routines, it's the I know where everything goes, that feeling of everything's right in the world because it's ordered and control. When we hit peak experiences, we start to have pattern recognition and synchronicities. We can go into systems thinking and be able to see the bigger patterns and the connections of those. And also ritual states. Like there's reasons why we like to go to churches and have the same rituals all the time, or birthdays. And there's something about that is very, those rituals in themselves induce states. Even rituals around, how you get up and do your morning routine, for example, that makes a difference. And when we use ritual, it helps us to do it on kind of automatic. But as we go into non-ordinary expanded states, now we can start to have relationship with the non-ordinary, and relation through prophecy, through communication with other beings, through the manipulation of time, because time is all about an order of things. And the idea of hearing a call, hearing something that's like your mission. People talk about that a lot in their sort of more non-ordinary states. And then the ecstatic experience, this is about the interconnectedness. Often when people have medicines like psilocybin, ayahuasca, there's these images of sacred geometry, of the interconnectedness of all of life, the underlying matrix and blueprint. And I had an ecstatic experience in Starbucks where I felt this. There was a picture of a star on a coffee machine, and I tuned into it, and I felt starness. And the next thing I know, everything broke open, where there was floorness and doorness, and so you start to feel the underlying order of life. And again, psilocybin is one of the medicines that I find most often will induce this feeling of interconnectedness, of seeing pattern and geometry. Religious practices, rituals, hypnosis, rhythm, something that's got a beat and rhythm to it, like trance, will help to also access these states. As a foundation of life, I'm thinking I really experience purpose as the underlying form, structure, and order of reality. So learn how to see, realize that everything connects to everything else. David Bohm is one of the leading physicists who has a very fleshed out philosophy and theory around that reality is just the surface phenomena, and that there's an explicit form and an explicit order to the universe that is unfolding, an implicate order. So there's again, I'll share so you can dive into some of these quotes more. And so purpose fears insignificance, being so like, oh, what am I? I'm just some little piece in this bigger web of life. And sort of the opposite in some ways is being limited, like I'm trapped, like I'm stuck in structure. I want freedom, I want creativity, and too much structure is going to limit me. And it's sort of, we flip flop between this sort of like meaningless, the nihilism, and also the like, will I actually have agency if everything's ordered and God has a plan, then will I actually have a say, or is it all predestined? These are the things that come up with these purpose states. And how do we prompt through purpose? We prompt through intention, why we want what we want. And there's a lot here around how do you actually create a container with purpose that is inviting life and others to come in and create with you and collaborate with you. The idea of beliefs, that's how we're making sense of what happens to us. We prompt through our beliefs and how we interpret events and feedback. And also what questions we ask is how we're also prompting through purpose. What are we wanting to learn? And finally, growth, that we go from survival and so this idea of achievement and accumulation to life force and emergence. And as life force, as our growth, as far as growth states go, as we access them, we feel more alive, we feel more charged, we get more movement. So from day to day, it's this idea of survival, getting shit done. You know, the productivity group mindset, growth mindset, or people that are really cultivating these states on a daily basis. And you can also think of orgasm as a peak state experience of life force. It's pleasure, it's aliveness, moving through sexual energy is life force. Adrenaline states, creative inspiration. And the non-ordinary expanded states, that sort of superhuman feats, the idea of flow states, improvisation, all of these can be very non-ordinary states. We drop into sort of time drops away and we're in that flow. And then from an ecstatic state, this is, people often talk about a Kundalini awakening. I had this in my early 20s, and it's a very different experience than the other two of God self or no self. This for me was an on fire feeling that was just moving through my whole body. There was so much pleasure and aliveness that it felt like 220 electricity trying to run through my 110 wiring. Here in the States, we have 110 and 220 wiring for our houses. And I also mentioned that murmuration, that movement, that it's got its own flow. Like nobody's saying to the flock, what are you doing? It's got its own energy and its own moving. And also charismatic healing. When we go into these I've gone to charismatic Christian events, and the healing that can happen when the life force gets channeled and speaking in tongues, and all of that is from this life force energy. So DMT also can have, DMT kind of does a lot of them, but amphetamines, coffee, adrenaline, cocaine, these are all ways that we are trying to charge ourselves up. And there's pleasure in them, right? So cocaine is a big addiction, and it was a big addiction in the 80s. Well, it gives you a charge. It makes you feel like you can do anything. So we want to understand what we're trying to chase and why we're doing it. And I want to put, as far as a foundation of life, growth as the animating force of life. That that this is what, without it, then the structure and purpose becomes stagnation. It becomes fixed. And so we always want to use, for example, structure of purpose in order to put the banks of the river on life force so that it can actually flow and generate what we want it to generate. Without that, without the sort of guardrails, it can also feel very chaotic. It can feel really scary. But it's funny, when I was looking at the quotes for growth, a lot of them were movie quotes like "Life Finds a Way" in Jurassic Park, and then there's all the "Let the Force Guide You" from Star Wars series. And, Chinese medicine, and there's qi and prana. There's so many words that we have for this force. And, as much as we love that life force and that aliveness, also the chaos can be incredibly scary. The idea of the unknown, death, the opposite of life is death, and the fear of annihilation again comes up in a different form here, and the idea of loss of control. And how do we prompt life through growth? We prompt it through actions, through movement, through aliveness. Sex magic is one of those where you're charging yourself up and sending it off into, through sexual energy and following what wants to happen. These are ways that we prompt. So I want to do a quick, I'm running a little bit long here, but I want to do a quick example of where some of these other traditions start to map on. And so Christian Trinity, a few months ago, I was meditating and I saw the image of the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I was seeing how it mapped onto the four forces. If you think of the Father as the source, as creation, as consciousness itself, the Son, Jesus, as the embodiment of the divine in physical form and human form, that would be expression. The Holy Spirit, that moving, animating force, that's the living current of divine energy. And I asked, what's purpose? And I heard logos, the idea of, and the world was created through word, divine reason, creative, and kind of the creative order of life, the divine order. So, and there's one more. Because of time, I'm not going to play it right now, but I will. It'll be in the replay. I'll also put it as a link for people. But I want to. This is well, it's only a minute and a half. So actually, let me play it here. I'm going to change my mind.
Matter can exist in various states. Atoms at high temperature always form gases. If you cool the gas, it becomes a liquid. If you cool the liquid, it becomes a solid. But under certain circumstances, if you cool atoms far enough to extremely low temperatures, they undergo a very strange transformation. They undergo an identity crisis. So let me show you what I mean by an identity crisis. When you go to low temperatures, the quantum mechanical properties of the atoms become important. These are very strange, very unfamiliar to us, but in fact, each one of these atoms starts to display wave-like properties. So instead of points like that, you have little wave packets like that moving around. It's really difficult for me to explain just why that is, but that's the way it is. Now, as you go to very low temperatures, the size of these packets gets longer and longer and longer. And then suddenly, if you get them cold enough, they start overlapping. And when they overlap, the system behaves not like individual particles, but particles which have lost their identity. They all think they're everywhere. This little wave packet over here can't tell whether it's this one or that one or that one or that one or that one or that. It's there and it's there and it's there. They're all in one great big quantum state. They're all overlapping. They're all doing the same thing. And what they're doing, to a good approximation, is they're simply sitting at rest. This Bose-Einstein condensate is very difficult to imagine or to visualize. I can imagine what it's like to be an atom running around gaily, freely, bouncing into things, sometimes going fast, sometimes going slow. But on the Bose condensate, I'm everywhere at once. I've lost my identity. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm at rest, and all the other atoms around at rest, but they're not other atoms around. We're all just one great big quantum system. There's nothing else like that in physics, and certainly not in human experience. So just to think about this causes me wonder and confusion. Matter can...
So what I want to just name from that last video is that when you start to think how he was talking about particles, I would show that is expression, that sort of individuality, right? And then it comes into, depending on the order, you get structure like water or ice. When things are in different orders, you would start to, that would be purpose. And then when things come to rest, right, that would be consciousness. There's just one. There is no individuality there. And what I see as the animating force is the way that they get from a particle to just one state is through energy through heat. So as you cool it, as energy is removed from the system, there's only one. But when you animate through life force, through heat in this case, then the particles get reanimated again and they have an identity then. So it's a very fascinating, I thought it was a very fascinating example of how these come together. And as you learn how to do all of these states and the skills with it, you develop what I call consciousness agility, the ability to be more like a helicopter and experience the world in a variety of ways. And I want to bookmark. I'm going to be talking about this more on Monday in sort of practical terms. But there's also what I feel is a distinction of a new state of consciousness, where when you hold them all at the same time, when you understand you're both a particle and everything at the same time, non-dual and dual at the same time. It's a sort of consciousness superposition that there is, I experience a new state, a new possibility that opens up. And on the next training, we're going to be looking at this idea of the multidimensional now and how do you actually navigate in this unknown territory, in this new territory, including what are these edges and what are these transformational or what is these edgy spaces that we can actually together learn and grow and create from. So that will be next week. So I'm going to stop there.